What if I told you that one of the most powerful countries in the world began as a collection of small colonies along the Atlantic coast? A nation that fought wars, survived crises, expanded across a continent, and eventually became a global superpower. How did it happen? And what lessons can we learn from one of the most fascinating stories in human history? So before we begin, grab your coffee, sit back, relax, and listen carefully until the end. Because America's story is filled with ambition, conflict, innovation, triumph, and transformation. In this episode, you'll discover how America was founded, how it gained independence, how it expanded across a continent, and how it became one of the most influential nations on Earth. Welcome back to Native Flow. Let's begin with Chapter 1, Before the United States, the Land and its First Peoples. Chapter 1, Before the United States, the Land and its First Peoples. Long before the United States existed, long before New York, Washington, or Los Angeles, the land we now call America was already home to millions of people. And honestly, this is where the story must begin. Because America's history did not start with the arrival of Europeans. It started thousands of years earlier. Now imagine North America before modern cities. No highways, no skyscrapers, no factories, just vast forests, huge rivers, open plains, towering mountains, and countless communities spread across the continent. These communities belonged to indigenous peoples who had lived there for generations. In fact, for thousands of years. Now here's something many people don't realize. There wasn't one Native American culture. There were hundreds. Different languages, different traditions, different beliefs, different ways of life. Some groups lived in forests. Others lived in deserts. Some hunted buffalo across the Great Plains. Others built large agricultural societies. And honestly, their civilizations were far more advanced than many people imagine. Now let's look at a few examples. In the Southwest, people built impressive settlements and irrigation systems. In the Mississippi Valley, large cities developed long before Europeans arrived. Some communities traded across enormous distances, creating networks that connected different regions of the continent. Now imagine living in North America hundreds of years before the United States existed. The continent was already full of history, already full of cultures, already full of stories. And honestly, this part of history is often overlooked. Now, let's move forward to the late 1400s, because a major change was about to occur. Across the Atlantic Ocean, European explorers were searching for new trade routes, new resources, and new opportunities. One of the most famous explorers was Christopher Columbus. His voyages opened the door to increased European exploration of the Americas. And honestly, the consequences would change world history forever. Soon, Spanish explorers arrived, then French explorers, then English settlers, and gradually, European influence across North America began growing. Now here's something important. The meeting between Europeans and indigenous peoples was complex. There was trade, cooperation, conflict, and, unfortunately, disease. Many indigenous communities suffered devastating population losses after contact with Europeans. Entire societies were transformed. And honestly, this remains one of the most significant and tragic chapters in American history. Now let's talk about the English colonies, because these colonies would eventually become the foundation of the United States. In 1607, the English established Jamestown in Virginia. It became the first permanent English settlement in North America. Life was extremely difficult. Food shortages, disease, harsh conditions. Many settlers did not survive, yet the colony endured, and over time, more colonies appeared. Now imagine arriving in a completely unfamiliar land. No modern technology, no modern transportation, no certainty about the future. The risks were enormous, but so were the opportunities. Thousands of people crossed the Atlantic hoping for a better life. Some came for economic reasons. Others came seeking religious freedom. And honestly, their decisions would shape the future of a nation that did not yet exist. By the early 1700s, 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Each colony was different, but together, they formed the foundation of what would later become the United States. At this point, the colonists still considered themselves British subjects. Independence was not yet the goal. In fact, few people could imagine what was coming next, but tensions were beginning to grow. Taxes, political disagreements, questions about power and representation, small conflicts that would eventually become something much bigger. Because in the next chapter, we'll explore how 13 colonies challenged one of the most powerful empires in the world and began the journey toward independence. Chapter 2: The American Revolution and the Birth of a Nation. Imagine challenging the most powerful empire on Earth. An empire with a massive army, a powerful navy, and influence across much of the world. Honestly, it sounds impossible. Yet that's exactly what 13 colonies would eventually do, and in doing so, they would change history forever. Now, let's go back to the mid-1700s. At this time, the American colonies were still part of the British Empire. Many colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects. They spoke English, followed British laws, and maintained strong connections with Britain. At first, the relationship worked reasonably well. But after a major conflict known as the 7 Years' War, things began to change. The war had been expensive, very expensive. Britain had accumulated significant debt, and the British government believed the colonies should help pay for it, so new taxes were introduced. Now imagine being a colonist. You are paying taxes, but you have no representatives in the British Parliament, no direct voice in the decisions affecting your life. Many colonists felt this was unfair, and honestly, their frustration continued growing. Soon, a famous phrase began spreading throughout the colonies: no taxation without representation. This simple idea became one of the most powerful slogans of the revolutionary movement. Now let's talk about a famous event. In 1773, a group of colonists protested British policies by dumping tea into Boston Harbor. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. The protest shocked Britain, and tensions increased dramatically. Now here's something fascinating. Neither side initially expected a full-scale revolution. Many colonists simply wanted their concerns addressed. Many British leaders believed the situation could be controlled. But as disagreements intensified, compromise became increasingly difficult. Then in 1775, fighting began. The American Revolutionary War had started. And honestly, few people expected the colonies to win. Britain possessed one of the strongest militaries in the world. The colonies lacked resources, lacked experience, and faced enormous challenges. Yet they had something powerful: motivation. determination, and a growing belief that they should govern themselves. Now let's talk about one of the most important figures in American history, George Washington. Washington became commander of the colonial forces. The situation was difficult. His army often lacked supplies. Food was limited. Conditions were harsh, and victories were not always easy to achieve. But Washington's leadership helped keep the revolutionary effort alive. Now here's one of the most important moments in the story. In 1776, the colonies took a remarkable step. They formally declared independence. The document became known as the United States Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. It announced that the colonies were no longer part of Britain. Instead, they would become a new nation, the United States of America. Now imagine the risk. If the revolution failed, many leaders could be punished as traitors. Everything depended on victory, and honestly, nothing was guaranteed. The war continued for years. There were victories, defeats, hardships, and sacrifices, but gradually, the revolutionary cause gained strength. An important turning point came when France decided to support the American colonies. French assistance provided valuable resources and military support, and honestly, this greatly improved the colonies' chances of success. Finally, in 1781, a major victory occurred at Yorktown. British forces surrendered. Although negotiations continued afterward, the outcome had become clear. The colonies had won. A new nation had been born. Now here's something remarkable. The revolution was about more than independence. It introduced ideas that would influence many countries around the world. Ideas about liberty, representation, self-government, and individual rights. Whether people agreed with every aspect of the new nation or not, its creation marked a major turning point in world history. Now, before we finish this chapter, I want you to remember something important. The United States was not born from certainty. It was born from risk, from difficult decisions, and from people willing to challenge one of the most powerful empires of their time. And in the next chapter, we'll discover how this young nation survived its early struggles and began expanding across an entire continent. Chapter 3, Building a New Nation and Expanding Westward. Winning independence was only the beginning, and honestly, creating a new country turned out to be much harder than creating a revolution, because now the United States faced a new challenge. How do you build a nation from scratch? Think about it. The colonies had defeated Britain, but they still needed a government, laws, institutions, a financial system, and a way to unite people across a vast territory. Nothing was guaranteed. In fact, many people doubted the new country would survive. Now imagine America in the late 1700s. There were no giant cities, no powerful military, no massive economy. The nation was young, fragile, and full of uncertainty. Yet its leaders believed something extraordinary was possible. Now let's talk about one of the most important documents in American history, the Constitution. After independence, American leaders gathered to design a new system of government. They wanted to avoid the mistakes they believed existed under British rule. At the same time, they wanted to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful. The result was the United States Constitution, and honestly, it became one of the most influential political documents ever written. The Constitution created a government with 3 branches, Each branch would balance the others. This system became known as checks and balances. The goal was simple: prevent excessive concentration of power. Now let's talk about leadership. Because the young nation needed stability, and no figure was more important during this period than George Washington. After leading the Revolutionary War, he became the first president of the United States. Many people trusted him, respected him, and viewed him as a symbol of national unity. Honestly, his leadership helped the country survive some of its earliest and most difficult years. Now here's something fascinating. At this point, the United States was still relatively small. Most of the population lived near the Atlantic coast. The vast lands farther west remained largely undeveloped by American settlers, but that would soon change, and dramatically. Now let's talk about expansion, because one of the defining themes of American history is growth. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a decision that would transform the country. The United States purchased a huge territory from France. This event became known as the Louisiana Purchase. The size of the country nearly doubled overnight. Think about that. One decision, and the nation suddenly became twice as large. It was one of the most important land deals in history. Now imagine the possibilities. New resources, new opportunities, new settlements, but also new challenges. Because much of this territory remained unexplored by Americans. This led to one of the most famous expeditions in history, the journey of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was to explore the new territory and learn more about the lands stretching toward the Pacific Ocean. The journey was long, dangerous, and incredibly difficult, but it helped expand knowledge of the continent. And honestly, it fueled the idea that America could continue growing westward. Now here's where things become more complicated. Expansion created opportunities, but it also created conflicts. As settlers moved west, they increasingly encountered indigenous nations that had lived on those lands for generations. Tensions grew, disputes emerged, and many Native American communities faced displacement and hardship. Honestly, this remains one of the most painful and debated parts of American history, because expansion brought progress for some, while bringing suffering for others. Now let's talk about the American spirit during this period. Many people believe the country's future lay in exploration, innovation, and opportunity. New towns appeared, roads expanded, trade increased, the nation continued growing both economically and geographically. And honestly, many Americans felt they were participating in a remarkable historical experiment, a new nation trying to define its identity. Now here's something important. Growth did not solve every problem. In fact, new disagreements were beginning to emerge. Questions about economics, political power, states' rights, and most importantly, slavery. These tensions would continue increasing year after year. Eventually, they would become impossible to ignore. And in the next chapter, we'll explore the conflict that nearly destroyed the United States and changed the nation forever. Chapter 4: The Civil War and the Fight That Shaped Modern America. Imagine a nation becoming so divided that its people go to war against each other, not against a foreign enemy, not against an invading empire, but against fellow citizens. Honestly, few events have shaped American history more than the Civil War, and few events have been more tragic. Now let's go back to the mid-1800s. By this time, the United States had expanded dramatically. New states were joining the country, the population was growing, the economy was developing rapidly. From the outside, America appeared to be moving forward. But beneath the surface, serious tensions were growing, year after year, decade after decade. And at the center of those tensions stood one issue: slavery. Now here's something important. Slavery had existed in America since the colonial period. Millions of African people had been forcibly brought to North America and enslaved. For generations, they were denied freedom and basic rights. And honestly, the issue became one of the deepest moral and political conflicts in American history. Now let's look at the country. The northern states and southern states were becoming increasingly different. The North was industrializing rapidly, factories were expanding, cities were growing. The South depended heavily on agriculture, especially cotton production, and much of that economy relied on enslaved labor. Because of these differences, arguments about slavery became more intense. Every time a new territory joined the country, people asked the same question: would slavery be allowed there or not? And honestly, the disagreements became impossible to ignore. Now let's talk about one of the most important figures in American history: Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president. His election alarmed many Southern leaders. They feared the balance of power was changing. Soon after, several Southern states decided to leave the Union. They formed a separate government known as the Confederate States of America. And just like that, the nation faced its greatest crisis. Now imagine the uncertainty. Families divided, communities divided, states divided. The future of the country itself was uncertain. Then, in 1861, war began. The American Civil War had started. And honestly, few people realized how devastating it would become. Now let's talk about the scale of the conflict. The war lasted 4 years. Battles occurred across vast areas of the country. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost their lives. Entire communities suffered. Families experienced enormous loss. It became one of the deadliest conflicts in American history. Now here's something significant. As the war continued, Lincoln increasingly connected the conflict to the issue of slavery. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This declared freedom for enslaved people in areas controlled by the Confederacy. The proclamation did not immediately end slavery everywhere, but it transformed the meaning of the war. The conflict was no longer only about preserving the Union. It also became a struggle connected to freedom and human rights. Now imagine the impact. Millions of enslaved people suddenly saw hope for a different future, a future that had seemed impossible for generations. And honestly, that change would alter the course of American history forever. Now let's talk about the end of the war. By 1865, the Union had gained the advantage. Confederate forces were weakening, resources were running out. And eventually, the Confederacy surrendered. The war was over. The United States remained one nation, but the cost had been enormous. Now here's another tragic moment. Only days after the war ended, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation had lost one of its most important leaders at the very moment victory arrived. And honestly, his death shocked the country. Now let's talk about the legacy of the Civil War. The war ended slavery in the United States. It preserved the Union. and it transformed the role of the federal government. But it did not solve every problem. Far from it. The years that followed would bring new struggles, new challenges, and a long fight for civil rights and equality. Yet despite those difficulties, the Civil War became a defining turning point. Because after it ended, the United States began a new chapter. A chapter marked by industrial growth, technological innovation, and an extraordinary rise in global influence. And in the next chapter, we'll discover how America transformed from a recovering nation into one of the most powerful countries in the world.